May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. What's the parable about? The low-hanging fruit simply leads us to pick on those who are well off. But there's a lot packed into this pretty familiar parable. It tells us something about the afterlife. I don't know what exactly. This concept of Hades as a place of suffering, by the time the gospel was written, that was still a relatively new concept. The place of the dead, Sheol, Hades, was for millennia in the belief structure of our Jewish sisters and brothers, was a place of the dead, where the dead went to sleep until the resurrection. You see that continuing in the New Testament with Paul. If you contrast Luke's gospel with Paul's writing, Paul is very much one of those, we die, we sleep, we rest in the Lord, and then on the day of resurrection, we're held accountable for our actions. But in that intertestamental period, the time between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and really just seeing traces of it in the later stuff in the Old Testament, Hades became a place not just to go to sleep and rest in the Lord until the day of judgment, but a place of punishment. And Jesus in Luke's gospel uses that concept of eternal punishment to waken us up, to sort of slap us upside the head and say, hey, pay attention. This is important. What we do, how we live our lives, how we treat each other, the responsibilities we bear for one another as we carry the cross for the sake of the world and serve our neighbor. This is important stuff. This is ultimate, life-giving stuff. But Luke's gospel takes a different tack than Paul in his writings. Not only does Luke contain this parable of the rich man suffering while Lazarus is tended to by Father Abraham. It's also in Luke's gospel that we have the story of the repentant thief who at the crucifixion, while the other thief rails against Jesus and taunts him. In Luke's gospel, in stark contrast to Mark and Matthew's gospel, where both thieves rail against Jesus, Luke's gospel alone has one of the thieves say to the other, "Why are you picking on him? We're getting our just rewards. We're thieves. We deserve this punishment. But this man has done nothing to deserve his." And then utters those immortal words, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." There's Luke's concept of the afterlife. Today you will be with me in paradise. So the parable may be telling us something about the afterlife, or it may be a rhetorical device of Jesus to say, drop what you're doing. Listen to me. This is important. It could be along the lines of Paul's writings. You'll notice in the epistle, you heard the accurate quotation, love of money. Money isn't the root of all evil. Love of money is the root of all evil. Maybe the parable is telling us something rather obvious about the dangers of being rich, but not recognizing your responsibilities. This was certainly true in the ancient Near East. If you were wealthy, that was a sign that you had worked hard and that you were better than other people. It was placing you in on a rung in a ladder of society that said, not only are you to be looked up to, but in the looking up to, there are responsibilities you bear. You and I know this concept in that familiar phrase, to whom much is given, much is expected. Okay. If you go to the ruins of Pompeii, you start to see the architectural evidence of the situation in the gospel this morning. Outside the wealthiest houses in Pompeii are stone benches. And those are benches upon which poor people could sit outside the houses of the rich. And as the rich came and went, entered and left the houses, they were expected to give alms to the poor, to whom much has been given, much is expected. And on feast days, whenever banquets were thrown, the poor would gather there waiting for the leftovers. You actually see that too. Alan, I'm going to wax lyrical about Henry VIII. I promise I will not sing the song, I'm Henry VIII, I am. Hampton Court Palace is still there, beautiful big brick structure. That's Henry VIII's palace. And you can still go in and see the kitchens where these great feasts were cooked. And I forget now exactly what that old Tudor English term for it was, but the local poor would come to the back door of Hampton Court Palace after Henry VIII's great feasts, because they got to eat leftovers, the like of which they could not imagine. But you've seen the movie, so you can imagine. So you get the gist, the historical setting of the rich man ignoring Lazarus. Lazarus has been dumped there. Alan, I forgot what the Greek word is, but there's a Greek word, and I'll look it up and send you an email later today. There is a Greek word that gets translated as, Lazarus was placed there or left there. But that Greek word really has connotations of him being dumped there, not left there, not crawling there, not deposited gently, but having been thrown there, left there, dumped there. He has no one except that rich man. And you'll notice this is a man who has feast after feast after feast. This is a man who daily has walked, been carried, been driven, whatever mode of transport, past Lazarus, and he didn't even see him. And that not only offends our modern sensibilities, but that would have been an enormous failure on that rich man's part in the society that Jesus is describing. Neighbors would have noticed what the rich man didn't notice. And all the town would have heard that this man was not holding up his part of the societal bargain. Word gets around, doesn't it? The little whispers, the ancient equivalent of parking lot conversations or water cooler conversations. The town would know that this rich man was failing. But it says a lot about relationships too. We get into these rut-filled relationships. And the thing about a rut is it can be comfortable, but blinding. Comfortable, yet blinding. So that even at this late moment in the parable, where the rich man has received his comeuppance, and the reality that he ignored for so long has been made plain to him, he still doesn't get it. And we know he still doesn't get it when we pay attention to the text, because we think he's had his come to Jesus moment, or at least his come to Father Abraham moment. But he hasn't. because he still wants to use Lazarus as a servant. Lazarus could do something for me. Lazarus could go and warn my brothers. He's still treating Lazarus like he's just a message boy. He doesn't say, isn't it wonderful that Lazarus now has what he's never had before, life and joy and dignity and grace. The man only sees someone who could take a message for him, run an errand for him. And is the rich man concerned about everyone? No, he's concerned about his brothers. He doesn't say, Father Abraham, find a way that everyone might know that there's a way of acting that I did not take, a path that I left untrodden, a responsibility I failed to fulfill. Go tell the world, Father Abraham. No, it's I want Lazarus to tell my family. I just don't want my brothers suffering this fate. To heck with everyone else. For some folks, it is too late. And lastly, though, I think it points out those relationships that get summed up in that old phrase that we've heard so often used sort of callously by politicians, but has a depth of meaning that I don't think we can possibly, plumb all of the depths of. It takes a village. It really does. If you read a biography, the biography of anyone, or an autobiography of almost anyone, unless they are full of themselves, and let's face it, that happens. There are people like that. But for the rest of us, the other 98% of us, I think we know that when we reach a certain point, we look back, and it's amazing how many people contributed to where we are today. I remember reading one autobiography of a former politician's spouse. If I told you the name of the person, half of you would cheer me on, and the other half would say, why are you reading books written by that person? So I'm not going to say who it was by. But in that book, she tells her life story. And I was struck by the memories of family members in Chicago who were part of raising her. And in her book, she describes them. The aunts and uncles who would care for her and her siblings while their parents were working. The uncle who had an enormous jazz collection that would play on the radio. Remember those record players where it was a piece of furniture and you lifted it up and the records were stored here and the turntable was there and the speakers were there? Of course, if you had a very fancy version of it, there was a little cocktail cabinet thrown in. There was the aunt who told stories about family members who were slaves in the South back in the day. There's testimony about the father who would work even though he was sick because he could make more by staying on the job than by leaving it, and he had a responsibility to his family, and that responsibility put him in an early grave, but by George, he fulfilled what he saw as his responsibility. And on. There's teachers who paid attention and gave time and effort, that gave their very best. And that woman decades later could name them, describe how they dressed, these teachers in that Chicago public school. There were folks who said, I'm going to take a risk on you and give you this job. And I've got to tell you, moving away from the politician now, I hear those stories when I have coffee with congregation members, or lunch, which is even better, with congregation members. And almost inevitably we talk about our faith to each other, and it's a conversation over breakfast or coffee or lunch, and it's not deep theology, it's personal experience, where many of you have told me your journey of faith and what led you to where you are now, and it's seldom Oh, Ken, the clouds parted and an array of light penetrated my soul and I belonged to Jesus from that moment on. No, I hear about grandparents nurturing, kindling the faith. I hear about singing in choirs where people have said the only positive male role models I had were the other men in the choir, to the extent that people who say, well, there are no male role models in church. The women were the role models, but no, by singing in the choir where the men were. This person saw a role model that he didn't see anywhere else in his life. I hear stories, I think I've told you before, of fine Wisconsin German family where the son is now a very distinguished pastor. Amy and I know him well. But he tiptoed downstairs one night wondering what his grandparents were up to, and they were kneeling together on the carpet by the fireplace, quietly singing old German Lutheran hymns to each other and praying together before they went to bed. Story after story of what it takes, the village it takes to make us who we are, that brings us one step along the way in this journey we share together. The web of relationships is rich and important. And the gospel text today shows us what happens when those webs of relationships break down, break apart. What do I want to say in conclusion? St. John Chrysostom. Chrysostom is just a fancy old phrase for golden mouth. He was one of the great preachers of the early church, St. John Chrysostom, John the Golden Mouth. He pointed out something that I'm going to leave you with. It speaks to our ability to see things as they really are, to remember our responsibilities, and to remember the God who instills that responsibility in us. The responsibility of seeing and of doing, the responsibility of the webs of relationships, the responsibilities about wealth, the responsibilities about love. John Chrysostom said, if you cannot see Jesus in the beggar at the door of the church, you will not see Jesus in the chalice at the altar. If you cannot find Jesus in the beggar at the door of the church, you cannot find Jesus in the chalice on the altar. May we see Father Abraham together, and may each of us see Lazarus together. May each of us love the other and love Lazarus together. Amen.